Hey you folks, welcome back to the channel. So the other day I said I was going to talk about electronics on bikes, and this was a suggestion from Paul Hope 3401 who commented on a previous video, and yeah, suggested that I talk about this topic. So like I mentioned in the video the other day, if you saw it, but if you didn't, the video the other day was just sowing the seed really for this video. And I mentioned that electronics was often a debated point in the motorcycle world. Some people love them, some people hate them. I guess more of the old school riders like myself probably prefer the analog style bikes, you know, the older sports bikes with, you know, minimal to zero electronics. And you know, maybe it's a sign of the times that younger riders who perhaps haven't grown up with these older sports bikes, maybe just having electronics is normal, right? They don't necessarily know any different. But yeah, it is often debated, and there are some uses, of course there are, and there are some drawbacks. So my plan for this video was to break it all down and to give you my thoughts. And like I mentioned on the other video, but again, just in case you didn't see it, often when people debate these points, they just give very broad views and they don't really dig into the whys and wherefores of each different type of electronic component, like quickshifters, ABS, electronic suspension, and you know, the whole shebang really. So I'm going to break it down. This might be a little bit of a lengthy video, so you know, settle in, grab yourself a coffee, and like always, feel free to share your comments and the thoughts as well. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to talk about each different type of electronic component, and I might even give it a score out of 10 based on my opinion. You might have a different opinion, but yeah, I'll give you my thoughts. So let's start by looking at one of the earliest versions of motorcycle electronics, which is quickshifters. So let's dig into that. Quickshifters. Very quickly, for anybody that doesn't know, what are they and what do they do? They are very popular now on road bikes. It's you know, very common that you'll see road bikes with either quickshifters fitted by the manufacturer, and a lot of people get aftermarket quickshifters like this one and fit it to their bikes. So a quickshifter allows you to make clutchless gear changes. Many of them will only allow you to make clutchless up changes, but not down. In order to make clutchless down changes, you either need to use the right technique on any bike, or you need an auto blip function, which some quickshifters give you on some bikes. And there's a little bit of there's a bit of a caveat to that, but I won't go into that right now. And the way that they work is when they feel pressure on the lever, they cut the ignition to the ignition coils, temporarily cutting the power. I mean, literally milliseconds, depending on how they're set up. And that allows the next gear to slot in because it takes the load off the gearbox. There's a bit more to it, but that's a very simple version. Quickshifters first came into racing, I think, in the early 80s. Late 80s, early 90s. And then on road bikes, probably around mid 2000s-ish. But nowadays, quickshifters are very popular on production bikes. Are they good? Are they bad? Is it worth the money? Well, the first question, are they good? Yes, they are. They're fun to use. It makes you feel a little bit more racy, and depending on the exhaust setup as well, sometimes you can have your exhaust make a bit of a pop every time you change gear, depending on the bike and the exhaust. So yeah, they're very good, and for an average rider, it gives you a sense of feel of, you know, that race bike sort of atmosphere. So I'm a fan of a quickshifter. However, if this bike didn't come with one when I bought it, so the previous owner or one of the previous owners had fitted this, if that hadn't have been the case, I probably wouldn't spend the money, because for the cost and compared to what it actually gives you in terms of benefit, I don't think it's worth the money. I mean, you might think differently, but Quickshifters can cost, you know, £300, £400, £500, depending on which one and which brand and how clever the system is. And for the sake of a slightly quicker gear change, I don't think it's worth it. So I've never bought one for a bike. Like I say, this bike had one when I bought it, and I'm glad it did because I really enjoy using it. But I just wouldn't spend that money. Now, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I think most people would say that it is a good thing. What would I give it out of 10? I'd probably give it an 8 out of 10. So a quick shifter, I'd give it an 8 out of 10. And the reason it's not a 10 is because one, the cost, and two, well, actually, let me break that down a bit further. The cost and the fact that it's another component to go wrong, and two, if it's not used correctly, it can cause huge, very expensive problems with your gearbox. Quick shifters can be quite temperamental if you don't use them right. They're best used at the high end of the rev range, sort of mid to high revs, when everything's spinning much faster. You shouldn't really use, and certainly not an aftermarket quick shifter at the lower end of the revs, because they're just not designed that way. And the gap between first and second gear tends to be a little bit bigger. So if you set up like a quick shifter like this, a HM quick shifter, you can adjust the sensitivity and the kill time. And if you set it up so it works well, it'll work well, but in the higher gears at higher revs. It won't work that well first to second gear because of the nature of first to second gear. That might be different on some bikes. The best performing aftermarket quick shifter, according to the research I've done, is a Translogic quick shifter, which is about 450 quid for this bike, and that allows you to use it between first and second gear a bit more safely. But the point is, it doesn't get a 10 out of 10 because of the cost and the fact that if it's misused, then a lot of stuff can go wrong. And personally, I think it's better to learn to change gears properly, because when you learn to change gears properly with the clutch, or even do clutchless gear changes up the box without the clutch, if you don't have a quick shifter, that's a really good skill to learn, and it helps you to develop a little bit of mechanical sympathy while you're riding. It allows you to sort of pay attention to what's going on underneath it. And if a newer rider has never ridden without a quick shifter and they just take the quick shifter for granted, they won't necessarily learn that little bit of feel that you get from a clunky gear change versus a smooth gear change from a sort of analog system without a quick shifter. So they're really good, but they cost a lot. Potentially a lot can go wrong if you misuse them. So for me, a quick shifter is an 8 out of 10. Right, now let's talk about electronic suspension. This is something you'll get maybe on more expensive bikes. And there's actually two types. There is semi-active and fully active. And the difference mainly and very simply is that semi-active suspension normally only adjusts damping. It doesn't really adjust preload, and it can't adjust the spring rate, and it can't actually move the suspension. Whereas fully active suspension can move the suspension, and therefore you don't rely so much on spring rate. There is so much more to it. It's very complicated. But it's two different types. If your bike has got electronic suspension, it doesn't mean to say it's the same system as on a MotoGP bike or a fully fledged little super bike, because they're very, very sophisticated and very complicated, even more so. But what does it do? It allows the bike to, or the sensors and therefore all the electronics to sort of read what's going on underneath the bike, and it can make some adjustments to account for the conditions, the speed that you're traveling, the amount of throttle input, and so on. It is a good system in the sense that there's less for you to think about, less adjustments for you to make manually, and yeah, it can make you more consistent. It won't necessarily make you faster, but it can make you more consistent. It can make the ride a little bit more consistent and plush over changing road conditions. So is it a good thing to have? I would say yes. However, a lot of race bikes and a lot of track day riders much prefer manually adjusted suspension, because a well set up, good sort of high value manual suspension system is much better and much more fine-tuned and fine-tunable than an electronic system. The electronic system has lots of tuning available to it depending on the bike and the system that you've got, and it's all done at the touch of a button rather than actually getting your spanners out and doing the measurements and worrying about feel, etc. But if you can manually set it up, then it's, you know, probably going to be better for you. So what would I give that out of 10? I'd say probably, I'd say a 7, because it doesn't necessarily mean to say you don't need any suspension knowledge. You can just dial it in and away you go. You still need a bit of knowledge. You might just need a bit less knowledge, but it doesn't account for everything. And depending on the system, you know, if it was amazing, if it was a 10 out of 10, then loads of race bikes would have it, but they don't. They have manually adjusted suspension, so they can make their own fine adjustments. So yeah, I'd give it a 7 out of 10. And the other downside that's holding it back, in my opinion, is expense. And if something goes wrong, it's a very, very expensive thing to fix. The other thing, don't forget, is that when you buy a bike and it's got electronic suspension, that suspension is set up for the equipment that it's got, the type of forks, the type of shock. And if you therefore change the shock or change the forks or change the spring rate, then the electronic setup of it isn't really going to be suitable, because you've changed the hardware, if you will. So you need to either adjust the software, or maybe it won't even work at all, you know, the way that it should work. But yeah, it's a good thing to have, but again, very, very expensive. And I would recommend anybody who's got electronic suspension still learn as much as you can about suspension, still experiment as much as you can with all the different settings. But personally, one more thing I would say is that messing about and changing all the settings through an electronic dash personally is a little bit more complicated anyway. I would much rather have the manual hardware, and I know that every turn of a spanner is going to make so much adjustment and therefore change the feel so much. So I'd prefer manual. Electronic can be really, really good. So 7 out of 10 for that. Right, now let's talk about traction control. Traction control again comes on a lot of expensive bikes. Can I borrow you for a minute? Yeah, just give me a second, babe. I'm just here doing manly stuff, being a man and that. Right, okay. I'll be in a minute. All right. Right. Sorry about that. Right, so yeah, anyway, traction control. What does it do? So traction control uses sensors, wheel speed sensors. Again, on some systems it uses an IMU, sort of the central brain of the electronic systems of the bike, and it measures wheel speed. So if, for example, you are mid-corner and you apply too much throttle and the back wheel starts to spin, then the traction control will kick in and it will cut the power temporarily, or as much as it needs to the bike, to try to either minimize or prevent that rear wheel spin. Therefore, it's, you know, very much a safety feature, isn't it, at the end of the day, to try to stop the rear wheel from sliding. So traction control helps to maintain traction. Is this a good thing? Yes, it is. Of course it is. I mean, it's a safety feature, right? So it's going to help prevent or help to minimize the chance of a rear wheel slide, or a high side even. Now, that being said, I believe that traction control won't completely stop you from crashing, and I think that's one of the big myths to sort of to bust, really. I don't think there is a system on the planet that will stop a human being from causing an accident. If somebody thinks that a bike has got all this electronics, therefore they're not going to crash, they're not going to high side, they're not going to low side, I think you're in a dream world. there are some very, very, very clever systems where you could be full lean angle and crack the throttle wide open, and the system will prevent a slide because that's what it's designed to do. But is it foolproof? No. If it was foolproof, then MotoGP riders would never high side. Race bikes would never crash in that sense. So it's not foolproof. Anywhere there's a human being involved in a system or using a system, there is a risk that it could go wrong, because we are the weakest link in the chain most of the time. So traction control is a really, really good thing. The biggest downside, and the reason that I'm going to give traction control a 9 out of 10, so quite a high score for this one, is because, let me put it this way. If you're a new rider and you've got traction control, or an inexperienced rider, then you're not necessarily going to really learn the feel of what it's like for the back wheel to become all squirmish and then have to control that by your throttle hand. And what I would recommend for every single rider on the planet is to get some off-road experience. Learn what it's like when the back wheel loses traction, because it is a fantastic transferable skill from off-road riding to on-road riding. Because ultimately there's going to be a time one day, whatever bike you've got, whatever systems you've got, there's going to be a time one day where you start to lose control a little bit, and you've got to regain that control. You've got to overcome that loss of traction, that uneven ground, that undulating bumps in the road, the gravel in the road, etc., etc. And even with traction control, there could still be a slight slip until the system kicks in and regains itself. And I've seen this firsthand. I haven't experienced it on a bike with traction control. I have ridden a bike with traction control, but I've never pushed it to that limit because it wasn't my bike, or those bikes didn't belong to me. But I've seen it where a friend of mine hit a bit of gravel, back wheel slipped out a little bit, but the traction control sort of saved him. So it will minimize the chance of something major going wrong. It will minimize the chance of you having an accident, but it won't completely prevent it, because like I said, we are the idiots in the system. So I would give traction control a 9 out of 10, but the baseline is, if they were uncrashable, then MotoGP races wouldn't crash. It's as simple as that. So 9 out of 10 for traction control, and get some off-road experience. So now on to wheelie control. Now, I think this is probably the best one out of the lot for a couple of reasons, and I'm still only going to give it a 9 out of 10, and I'll explain why in a second. What does wheelie control do? Well, as you pull the throttle back and as the front wheel starts to rise, the system will, like similar to traction control, it will cut the power, and it will allow that front wheel to hover a little bit. So the bike's still under power, the bike still wants to sort of tilt backwards, but the power is being managed by the electronic system to prevent that front wheel from looping out and prevent you disappearing off the back of the bike. So it's a really good system. Again, like all of this, it derived from racing, and the idea of wheelie control isn't so that you can do a 12 o'clock dank nooner down through Asda car park or anything like that. The idea of wheelie control is on a racetrack, as you're pulling out of a corner and accelerating, it allows the bike to keep driving forward, so it doesn't waste energy by the front wheel coming up too high in the air. So it allows you to maintain momentum in a forward direction. That's what wheelie control is for. Is it another system that's going to prevent you from crashing? Absolutely not. I don't think it's going to absolutely completely prevent you from looping the bike out, depending on what you're doing. Remember, the human being, we are the idiots in the system. According to Michael Neves from MCN magazine, he explained that wheelie control is designed under acceleration to work best. but it's not designed if you do a massive clutch up. If you dump the clutch and redline it to bring that front wheel in the air, then the system isn't designed that way, and it might not always catch you in time to prevent you looping the bike out completely. So again, it's not idiot proof, it's not human proof. So I would give it a 9 out of 10. But the reason it's quite high is because, you know, you can be a bit more heavy-handed with the throttle. You can be a bit more aggressive in your acceleration, your riding style, because it is a little bit of a safety barrier. But once again, similar to what I said with traction control, you know, it does take a little bit away from having that feel and that manual throttle control, which is priceless, absolutely priceless. So I would still recommend, even if your bike's got wheelie control, if it's got the ability to turn it off and experiment with it off. Don't obviously dump the clutch and redline it. I don't mean that kind of experiment. I mean, just see what it's like under heavy acceleration. You know, see how lively that front end is and just learn some control. And the other reason I'm saying that we should all learn control without these systems is because what if the system fails? And this is a big problem when I come on to the next thing we're going to talk about, which is ABS, because we've all heard the horror stories. So I'm not going to give any of these systems a 10 out of 10 because they can go wrong, they can fail. And in most cases, it's a very expensive fail. So yeah, wheelie control, 9 out of 10. Good thing for the most part. Okay, now on to the dreaded ABS that probably most bikers dislike, right? For very, very good reason. ABS symptoms, ABS systems, anti-lock braking system, they are a safety feature. When they work well in emergency situations, they can be very, very beneficial because they can prevent the front wheel locking up, they can stabilize the bike. So the way it works, very, very simply, and there are different levels of complexity depending on what type of system that you get and how expensive. The way it works very, very briefly is when you pull the front brake, if the bike sort of feels as though there's going to be a loss of control or at a certain amount of brake pressure from the front brake, the system will also send some of that braking force to the rear caliper, and it will apply a little bit of rear brake, and it will be sort of you know, a certain percentage front and a certain percentage rear. And the idea is, other than to stop the front wheel locking up, but it's also to keep that bike stable. If you imagine that under heavy braking your bike is going to tilt forward and the rear wheel is going to come off the ground potentially. So it's designed to, when you apply a little bit of rear brake, the rear of the bike squats a little bit. It keeps the rear wheel on the ground and therefore adds more braking force overall, because now you're using sort of both ends of the bike to slow the bike down. So it helps keep things stable under braking, and it helps to increase the amount of actual braking force that is being used to slow you down. So in theory, very, very, very good, and it is another safety system. The downside is, and to give you a little bit of context if you don't already know this, the wonderful boffins in Brussels, the EU, decided that, I think from about 2011, don't quote me on that year, but it's around 2011-ish, EU regulations dictated that all new bikes produced from that date onwards, or whatever date it was, had to have some sort of ABS system, which meant that manufacturers now have to spend a lot more money developing a system to put it onto the bike, and of course we then bear the brunt of that cost when we buy a bike. It also means that even the bikes at the cheaper end of the market have to have some sort of ABS system. Now, I'm going to use the Yamaha YS125 as an example here. So a relatively low-end, cheap bike. But on a bike like that, the ABS system is very, very rudimentary. In fact, it uses what's known as a combined braking system. So the front and the rear brake are mechanically linked. And that means that if you ride along and you just press the rear brake, you'll feel the front brake lever pulling as well, because it will apply front brake even though you've only pressed the rear brake. This can be really, really unsettling on a bike. And it does take away a little bit of control and some feel from the rider. Another thing that takes away some control and feel is because of an ABS system's complexity, and I'm talking about a more, not just the Yamaha example now, I'm talking about other systems. There isn't any direct feel between the front brake lever and the caliper. So on this bike, for example, there is a brake line from the front brake master cylinder that leads down to the caliper. So when you pull that front brake, the pressure that you feel is coming directly from the caliper. But on an ABS bike, that first brake line doesn't go directly to the caliper. It goes to an ABS pump, which is probably then got another line that goes to an actuator or a control unit or a central pump. My Fireblade, for example, had 3 ABS pumps. Luckily, the ABS was removed, but originally it had 3 ABS pumps. So you got a very, very complex system of brake lines, fluid going to different parts, valves inside each pump. And a major downside of ABS is the cost of bleeding the system. I've heard some people quote that it would take about £300 to have their ABS system flushed and bled through. Like, that's ridiculous. To bleed brakes, £300 is ridiculous. And it's because the process takes a lot longer and is so much more involved. And of course, if you then decide to upgrade your brake lines to steel braided lines, like this bike has, on this bike it's simple. But on an ABS bike, it's going to cost you a lot more because there's more lines to upgrade. Now, what are the goods? The good parts of ABS? Obviously, safety, like I mentioned, in an emergency braking situation, they could help. A newer rider who hasn't yet developed the skill of effective braking, it can help. It can help massively. But like I've said previously with a couple of these electronic systems, a newer rider who's never ridden a bike without ABS isn't necessarily going to develop that real fine feeling of being in control of what the brakes are doing and then being able to manually adapt your braking style to suit the conditions and the speed and everything else. So for me, I'm going to score ABS a 4, and that's pretty low, right? But expensive, overcomplicated, and I'll come on to the big problem in a second. Expensive, overcomplicated, sometimes dangerous, and just, yeah, it's forced upon us, isn't it, for newer bikes. The huge problem with ABS that some people report is an ABS system failure. So I've even heard of people riding along normally, not necessarily caning it, not necessarily being aggressive, just riding along normally, go for the front brake, and all of a sudden the bar comes all the way back to the lever and they've got no brake pressure whatsoever, and they have to manually pump, usually in a panic, causing a brown stain in the trousers, before they get any braking feel back. So it is possible for an ABS system to fail, and you won't know that it's failed necessarily unless you either get a flashing light on your dashboard if you've got an electronic dash, or until you go for those brakes. And can you imagine going for your brakes and having no brakes and no room to move out of the way? That is a disaster waiting to happen. So the fact that it's forced upon us, the fact that it can be so unreliable and dangerous, I would give it a 4 out of 10. And finally, on ABS, there is a reason that race bikes do not use ABS. If it's good enough for them not to use it, I'd say it's good enough for us to at least have the choices whether to have it or not. So those are my thoughts on those various common electronic aids that you might get on some bikes. But like I said, I think it's worth breaking it down, because for somebody to say electronics are bad or electronics are good, it doesn't tell the whole picture. If I was to buy a bike and money was no object, what would I have? Well, I'd have a Quickshifter if money was no object. I'd have wheelie control and maybe traction control. But I've got an off-road background. I'm used to the bike moving around. I've been riding long enough, etc., etc. So those are the things that I would choose. I wouldn't want ABS, and I wouldn't be fussed about electronic suspension either, to be honest. But I wouldn't say that any of those systems are bad, except for ABS, or at least the fact that ABS is forced upon us. I think we should have the choice. But yeah, I think the fact that newer riders get very little choice in that, or when you're buying a newer bike you get very little choice in that, I think is a ridiculous thing, really. And one thing that winds me up is manufacturers produce ABS systems. The EU dictate that we need to use them, so surely they should get together and figure out much more of a sort of much more of a fail-safe. They know it's possible. The manufacturers know it's possible. The EU, who make these rules, must know it's possible. The ABS systems can fail mid-ride and be far more dangerous than not having ABS. Surely by nowadays there should be a fail-safe to prevent that. But like I said, folks, electronic systems do not take away all need for human intervention or control. And learning some really good skill, and as I've said a couple of times now, go off-roading, do some off-road training. It'll cost you 250 quid for a day's off-road training. You will learn a ton of transferable skills that you can use on the road if you ever need to. It won't compensate for experience. Sometimes electronics dampen the experience. Sometimes they dampen the feel that you get from a bike. And I should probably also say, right, I have ridden quite a few bikes with electronics. And I remember the very first time I did feel a little bit disconnected. I haven't spoken about ride-by-wire throttle. That's something slightly separate. Ride-by-wire throttle comes on a lot of newer bikes as well, a lot of more expensive bikes. But yeah, that's a little bit by the by. And some of the components like auto blipper, which I mentioned earlier, will depend on ride-by-wire throttle. But I've spoken about the main ones, and hopefully I'll get some of your thoughts and see what you think of these electronic systems. So I can't say whether they're good or bad. I'm probably waffling now, so I'll bring this video to a close. But yeah, next time we're discussing electronics, folks, next time you're down the pub or chatting to some friends and somebody said electronics are bad, it's absolutely ridiculous, maybe you can give them a bit of a balanced view and say, well, it's not all bad, and it's not always bad, and it's not in every situation that it's bad, but it's worth digging into. It's worth the conversation. So hopefully this has been interesting, folks. Thank you for listening as always, and yeah, stay tuned on the channel for more videos as and when they come. If anybody's got any more suggestions of things you want to talk about, feel free to drop them in the comments.